Welcome to Season 3, Episode 8 of CSS Breakdown, Book by Book. In this chapter of Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society, we turn our focus to religion, an institution that has both reflected and reinforced gender inequality across centuries, while also becoming a site for feminist resistance and reinterpretation. Now, right from the start, diving into religion and gender is complex territory. These are deeply held beliefs, ancient traditions, and for many, a core part of their identity.
Absolutely. It's vital to remember we're exploring the sociological patterns and historical dynamics laid out in this book. We're not here to validate or critique any particular faith's truth claims, but rather to understand the author's analysis of how gender plays out within these structures.
Exactly. And the book throws us right into it with a striking anecdote from 1991. It was Father's Day, and John Cardinal O'Connor, the Archbishop of New York City, gave a sermon. The next day, the New York Post, the tabloid, ran this huge headline, "God is a man."
Right, yeah, quite sensational. But the actual quote was a bit different. That headline, as the book notes, captured the public imagination, but was also a bit of tabloid sensationalism. Cardinal O'Connor's actual words were more nuanced.
Okay, so more nuanced. What did he actually say?
Well, according to the source here, he said, "In the fatherhood of the Almighty God is, of course, all personhood, the personhood of mother and father simultaneously."
Okay, so he wasn't just being simplistic, he was trying to fold in the feminine.
He was attempting to express the totality of divine personhood, but, and this is the key part, he immediately followed it by quoting a Vatican official.
Oh, okay.
And this official basically shut down any deviation from the male metaphor, saying, "We are not authorized to change the our father into an our mother."
And that official was Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, right? Who later became Pope Benedict XVI.
That's the one. So even with O'Connor's attempt at nuance, that Ratzinger quote, combined with that headline, well, it landed hard for a lot of women.
Yeah, I can imagine. It felt like this stark reminder that within the church hierarchy, their inequality was non-negotiable, divinely sanctioned even.
Exactly. The book mentions a German theologian who used a rather pointed analogy about a donkey thinking God must be a donkey because, from the donkey's perspective, a donkey is the peak of creation.
Oof, that's blunt.
It is. But it's a powerful way of saying that when you define the ultimate divine being solely in male terms, especially within an institution where men hold all the power, it looks an awful lot like you're just projecting your own power structure onto the divine.
Right. It feels less like a description of the sacred and more like a reinforcement of human, specifically male, dominance.
And this moment, this whole flare-up over our father, the book positions it as just the latest skirmish in a battle that's been going on for centuries.
So a really long struggle. How is God gendered? Why have prophets historically been male? What are the divine prescriptions for relationships between men and women? Are men and women meant to have equal roles in religious life and leadership?
These are the big foundational questions this chapter really digs into.
So what's the core argument the book presents?
Well, the author argues that the major monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have historically played this crucial dominant role.
Okay.
Both through their doctrine and as powerful social institutions, they have asserted that men and women are fundamentally different. And here's the kicker. They've claimed this difference is not just biological or social, but part of a divine plan.
Ah, the divine plan argument.
Exactly. And this perceived divine difference then becomes the justification for assigning different tasks, different roles, and crucially, different hierarchical positions, leading to the subordination of women.
So the book is arguing that religious doctrine serves as this deep wellspring for claims of essential, eternal gender difference.
Right.
And the religious institution provides the foundational structure to justify and maintain gender inequality in society.
Precisely. It's a feedback loop. The beliefs shape the institution, and the institution reinforces the beliefs. But the book immediately offers a contrast. It reminds us that this isn't the only way religion could be.
Right. It doesn't have to be this way. You could imagine religious systems where equality is celebrated, not just tolerated.
Think about systems like certain interpretations within Buddhism that emphasize complementarity, like the concept of yin and yang, distinct energies perhaps, but equally necessary and valued parts of a whole. Or pantheistic traditions with a whole array of gods, some gendered male, some female, some maybe not gendered at all, each representing different aspects of the cosmos. These models offer alternative ways to conceptualize the divine and human relationships that aren't inherently hierarchical based on gender.
And that contrast is really the jumping-off point for our mission in this deep dive. Using only the material in this chapter of the gendered society, we're going to unpack how major Western religious traditions became so intertwined with gender inequality,
How that's been challenged and reinterpreted.
and explore some of the surprising paradoxes about gender and faith that exist today.
Okay, let's explore the historical record then, because the book strongly suggests the picture wasn't always this way.
Yes, looking back at pre-modern societies, the historical record is just filled with goddesses. As the book describes it, a proliferation of them. From the earliest human communities, you see goddesses associated with fertility, reproduction, and later, the bounty of the harvest.
And this is where the work of early anthropologists comes in, as highlighted in the source. Many propose that these polytheistic cultures, sometimes imagined as primitive matriarchies, were gradually supplanted over time, often through conflict or conquest.
The book specifically points to Marija Gimbutas, the archaeologist.
Ah, yes, her work on Neolithic Europe.
Right, roughly 6500 to 3500 BC. She argued this period featured a goddess-oriented civilization, which she described as peaceful, harmonious, centered on nurturing sensuality.
A very different picture.
Very different. And that this civilization was violently disrupted and ultimately destroyed by patriarchal, weapon-wielding horsemen who invaded from the Russian steppe.
It paints a really dramatic origin story for the shift away from female divinity. And the sheer scope of goddess worship is staggering, even just looking at the examples the book gives that start with the letter A.
Like what?
Astarte, Anat, Anahita, Asherah, Ataret, Atar, Aju. And the source notes there were hundreds, maybe even thousands, of goddesses across various pantheons globally.
Wow. And anthropologist Peggy Reeves Sanday, in Female Power and Male Dominance, also connects the rise of male domination in Europe and the Middle East to this shift.
How so?
The triumph of the unseen, all-powerful sky gods associated with men over the visible, immediate, pragmatic earth goddesses associated with women.
That's a powerful symbolic shift, moving from worshiping the earth that gives life directly, something tangible, to worshiping a distant figure in the sky.
And this isn't confined to ancient history, right?
Not at all. The source notes that cultures today still worship goddesses. It mentions animist religions in Africa, like the Yoruba, whose traditions influenced voodoo and Santeria in the Western Hemisphere, maintaining a space for women's spiritual power.
We also see echoes in classical mythology, like the Greek and Roman pantheons with their paired gods and goddesses, Zeus and Hera, Ares and Aphrodite.
Right.
Figures like Athena, who embody wisdom and strategy.
Mesopotamians revered Ishtar. Isis in Egypt and Demeter in Greece were seen as goddesses not just of fertility, but of law and justice too.
Right.
The ancient Near and Middle East cultures were particularly rich in fertility goddesses, believed to control the fundamental forces of life and death.
And some cultures developed what the book calls matriarchal religions,
where the Great Mother was literally seen as the ultimate source of all creation and life.
So this wasn't a minor thing. Female divinity was widespread.
Exactly. And the persistence of these female deities in many contemporary non-industrial cultures, according to the book, suggests that this perspective, seeing the female as both divine and equal, addresses fundamental cultural and spiritual needs across time. Needs that perhaps go unmet in societies where such viewpoints have been suppressed or lost.
The book contrasts this with older traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism.
Right. Hinduism has a rich pantheon of gods and goddesses, though the author acknowledges that religious practice within Hinduism often allows for significant gender inequality in social roles. So the theology might be inclusive, but the social reality isn't always.
And Buddhism.
Buddhism, which is older than Judaism, doesn't center on a singular external god figure, but rather emphasizes the potential for spiritual awakening within all humans. Less about hierarchy from above, more about potential within.
So you have these diverse spiritual landscapes, some rich with female divinity, others focused on internal potential rather than external hierarchy, and then,
as the book starkly states, monotheism changed all that.
Okay, here's the shift. And the book is very clear that the concept of the single unitary God who spoke to Abraham was, from the beginning, unquestioningly male.
This God had varied attributes: merciful, vengeful, patient, fatherly, but the voice, the essence, was male.
The source offers this fantastic thought experiment.
Oh, the Charlton Heston one.
Yeah. Imagine Charlton Heston ascending Mount Sinai in the Ten Commandments and hearing a gentle, feminine voice from the burning bush instead of the booming male one.
What does the author think would have happened?
The author's take. It likely wouldn't have been taken seriously at the time, possibly even seen as profoundly heretical, something you could be persecuted for suggesting.
Which powerfully illustrates just how deeply and swiftly that male image of God became ingrained as the only acceptable divine representation within these traditions.
And this assertion of a singular male god, combined with the emergence of normative codes prescribing women's subordination, well, that had profound practical consequences throughout history.
It wasn't just theoretical, was it?
Not at all. It meant the practical, real-world elevation of men over women. And crucially, it involved the active suppression and stamping out of those earlier traditions that honored female equality, divine reproductive power, or goddesses.
The book frames the history of religion in Europe for 2 millennia, particularly under the aegis of Christianity, as a relentless process of purification.
Purification. Meaning what, exactly?
A constant search for doctrinal truth that involved identifying and suppressing any deviation or alternative viewpoint, kind of like narrowing the acceptable range of belief.
And this is a crucial insight from the book. Much of what we think of as divinely ordained gender roles, particularly the rules around women's subordination and deference, aren't necessarily explicit in the original scriptural texts.
Exactly. The author argues these norms came later. They were added through centuries of commentaries by mortal men, interpretations of the scriptures shaped by the specific historical and social context of the interpreters.
So the inequality is often in the interpretation, not the text itself.
That's the argument. The distinction is really important. It suggests the inequality isn't an inherent, unavoidable part of the faith, but a result of human choices made over time about how to interpret sacred writings.
And the book notes that entire doctrinal traditions were declared heresy and suppressed. It mentions contemporaneous gospels and other early texts from the Christian era.
Texts that suggested more egalitarian relationships between the sexes and even the potential divinity of women.
But these ideas never fully vanished, did they?
No, the book suggests they simmered just below the surface of dominant traditions, fueled by what the author calls the eternal human desire for equality and the elevation of women.
And these suppressed ideas sometimes reemerge, even in unexpected places.
Like the reference to Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code.
Ah, right.
Yeah, the book mentions that pop culture phenomenon, calling it a quasi-feminist text, for picking up on these historical threads, the Gnostic Gospels, the potential significance of Mary Magdalene, and weaving them into a fictional narrative where the Vatican hierarchy is trying to hide an alternative history.
An alternative history suggesting a more egalitarian relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Exactly. It shows how these suppressed narratives still capture the imagination.
And the book connects this suppression of alternative, more female-inclusive spiritualities, like the goddess traditions, to the historical persecution of figures like witches.
Yes, and which, in its original sense, meaning wise one. These were often women who held considerable social power, healers, midwives, those ritually connected to medicine and birth.
So independent of male control.
Precisely. And thus, according to the source, they threaten the consolidation of patriarchal power within the emerging religious hierarchies. Carol Christ is quoted, noting how the wise woman was often the first one consulted at life crises.
Delivering babies, treating illness.
Right, often before the priest was called for baptism or last rites, they held practical, immediate power.
So the church, feeling its spiritual authority challenged and often deeply misogynistic, actively persecuted these women,
seeing them as rivals for both spiritual influence and social control. The suppression wasn't just theological. The book argues it was profoundly about consolidating male power.
This history of suppressing alternative viewpoints and establishing a male-defined God and hierarchy really lays the groundwork for understanding how doctrines of difference calcified into doctrines of inequality.
Let's explore that further, how these canonical texts, despite potential ambiguity, became interpreted to prescribe rigid, often unequal, gender relations.
Okay. The book points out that texts like the Bible and the Quran are often viewed as normative blueprints for how relationships should be.
It estimates that something like 4/5 of the Quran is dedicated to prescribing and proscribing relations between women and men.
Wow, that's a huge portion.
It is. And similarly, both the Old and New Testaments are extensively concerned with regulating domestic life.
And here's where that point about interpretation comes back. The author makes the crucial observation that the sacred texts and the prophets themselves are often more equanimous, or at least ambiguous, than their subsequent male interpreters have indicated.
Equanimous,
Right.
meaning more balanced.
Yeah, or at least open to different readings.
Yeah.
That tension between the potential ambiguity of the original text and the often rigid interpretations that followed, that's where centuries of conflict within these traditions arise.
Absolutely. The interpretations weren't the only possible ones, but they became the dominant ones. Look at the examples the book provides. Jesus, for instance.
Right.
The author suggests he showed equal concern for women, even singling out those marginalized by society. Junia, referred to as an apostle in Romans 16, is cited as evidence that women held significant leadership roles in early Christianity.
And theologian Leonard Swidler is quoted stating that Jesus' actions and words indicated he saw women as the equals of men, and he neither said nor did anything which would indicate that he advocated treating women as intrinsically inferior to men.
That's a strong claim for an egalitarian Jesus figure based on the source material.
It is. Then there's Muhammad. The book credits him with introducing what were, at the time, startling reforms for women.
Like what?
Insisting on women's consent before marriage, granting them the right to initiate divorce under certain circumstances, allowing them to inherit and maintain property, and ensuring their entitlement to conjugal rights. They were also held to the same standards for prayer and fasting.
Those sound like significant steps toward equality, especially in that historical context.
They were, but the book immediately contrasts this with other aspects of the tradition as it developed. Men were permitted multiple wives, up to 4 if they could provide for them all equally.
Okay.
And women were deemed subservient because men were a degree above them, according to the Quran, because God has made one to excel over the other.
So you see both progressive elements and elements of prescribed inequality within the same tradition's foundational texts. It's complicated.
Very. Ancient Judaism is described with a similar tension. Women's rights were protected in many ways, yet they were still broadly considered subordinate to men.
All of this reinforces the book's central thesis in this section. The inequality we see enforced today is more often in the commentaries and subsequent interpretations rather than being an inevitable consequence of the original texts.
The ambiguity could have been interpreted differently.
Could have been. But historically, the dominant interpretations went the other way, reinforcing hierarchy.
And the book gives powerful, concrete examples of how these subsequent interpretations manifested. St. Paul's epistles are frequently cited.
Yes. Ephesians 5:22-24 is a classic example. Let the wives be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, because a husband is head of the wife. But just as the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husband.
Pretty unambiguous there.
And 1 Corinthians 11:3, the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a woman is her husband. The author notes that Paul appears most obsessed with women's subordination among the early Christian writers.
And this isn't just ancient history. The book points to the Southern Baptist Convention in 1998.
What happened there?
In response to growing feminism, they amended their statement of beliefs to include that a wife should submit graciously to her husband and act as his helper.
Wow. Bringing those traditional hierarchical interpretations right into modern doctrine for a major denomination.
And Orthodox Judaism is presented as another clear example where gender inequality is explicitly woven into religious law and practice.
How so, according to the book?
Well, it lists several ways. Women cannot be rabbis, cannot read from the Torah during services, cannot sing in synagogue or lead worship. Only men count towards a minyan, the minimum quorum for prayer.
Okay.
Women cannot initiate marriage or divorce. The book notes the difficulties women face praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, mentioning instances of physical attacks by some Orthodox men trying to prevent them from praying in mixed spaces or wearing prayer shawls.
It also mentions the informal morality brigades in some Orthodox communities.
Right, where men publicly harass women for perceived immodesty or dictate where they can sit on buses.
And the author draws a direct, striking comparison here,
To the Taliban.
noting that this behavior sounds awfully similar to the roving bands of Muslim purification groups that roamed Afghanistan under the Taliban, enforcing its gendered code of conduct.
That comparison really highlights how these interpretations move beyond just theological points and become systems of social control, sometimes enforced with intimidation or violence.
Exactly. The book's point is that while the origin might be doctrinal conflict over interpreting texts, the effects are profoundly social and political. These conflicts are often expressed as secular policies or frame political debates.
Like the example from 19th century America, where Protestant clergy were major figures in the anti-suffrage movement.
Yes, the source quotes Reverend John Todd arguing against women's rights based on their divinely created frail constitutions, requiring them to be exempted from certain things which men must endure.
Justifying keeping them out of college, professions, and voting.
Right. But the book immediately provides the counterpoint. Many other Protestant ministers were passionate supporters of women's rights.
Okay, so it wasn't monolithic.
No. Reverend Samuel B. May's 1846 sermon, The Rights and Condition of Women, is cited as a powerful example. He argued that denying women the vote was as unjust as the disenfranchisement of the males would be, stating there was nothing in women's nature to disqualify them from understanding community interests or acting wisely politically.
So the debate was active even within religious circles, based on different interpretations of sacred texts or divine will regarding gender roles.
Absolutely. And we see similar variations in practice today, even within the same broad religious tradition like Islam.
How so?
Well, while many Islamic societies adhere to traditional gender roles with men as household heads and women in the private sphere, the book points to Indonesia.
The world's largest Muslim country.
Right, as a counterexample. There, women wear Western clothing, work in diverse professions, girls attend school freely, and men and women are equally enfranchised. This demonstrates that even within a single faith, practice and interpretation can vary dramatically based on historical, cultural, and social context.
So it's clear that doctrine and interpretation shape institutions and societal practices, but the book also delves into a particularly intimate way gender inequality is enforced. The politicization of the body.
This is where religious rules intersect directly with daily life, dictating what people can and cannot do with their physical selves. The book notes that all monotheistic religions have prescriptions and proscriptions related to the body.
Like Christian head coverings.
Exactly. The book notes men were sometimes discouraged from covering their heads, perhaps to distinguish from Jewish practice, which required it, while women were required to cover theirs.
And Paul's rationale.
Paul's rationale in 1 Corinthians 11:7-9 is cited. Man is the image and glory of God. Woman is the glory of man. Woman is from man. Man wasn't created for woman. Woman was created for man. This provides a theological justification for a physical rule about hair and fabric.
Okay, linking doctrine to physical practice.
Then in some fundamentalist Islamic societies, this policing of the body reaches extremes. The book describes a requirement for women to be completely concealed in public, hidden under garments like the chador, often accompanied by a male relative, with no body or face visible.
And it mentions the risks for defiance in places like Afghanistan under the Taliban.
Acid attacks, public shaming, ritual stonings, stark consequences.
And it's not just women's bodies. Men's bodies are policed too in certain interpretations.
Yeah, the book mentions that since the Prophet Muhammad wore a beard, some fundamentalist interpretations dictate that Muslim men must wear beards. It describes instances of potential execution for shaving and barbers having their hands cut off in the most extreme interpretations.
But again, contrast this with countries like Indonesia, where such demands are virtually unheard of.
Right. And then there's the Orthodox Jewish practice of ritual cleansing related to menstruation.
Tell us about that.
Well, the book details how this deems women ritually unclean for about 12 days each month, nearly half the time. Anything she touches is considered impure, sometimes leading to physical segregation from men.
For almost half the month?
Roughly.
Yeah.
7 days after her period ends, she must immerse herself in a mikveh, a ritual bath, to be purified and rejoin communal and marital life.
Okay. From an outside perspective, practices like forced concealment or ritual uncleanliness might seem solely oppressive, designed to control women's bodies and movements.
And the book acknowledges that perception, but then presents fascinating sociological studies that reveal how people, particularly women, practicing these traditions can attach very different, even empowering meanings to them.
Like Deborah Kaufman's study of young women who were converting to or becoming more Orthodox Jewish.
Exactly. Kaufman found that these women often experienced the practices as empowering. It put them, she found, in touch with their own bodies, in control of their own sexuality, and in a position to value the so-called feminine virtues of nurturance, mutuality, family, and motherhood.
That's completely counter to the outsider perspective. It suggests agency and positive meaning within the practice.
And a study of Orthodox Jewish women in Israel similarly showed a wide spectrum of responses. While one woman felt the long hands of the rabbis literally entering my body, seeing the mikveh and related rules as purely oppressive.
Right.
Another cherished the practice as a sense of renewal. She felt accepted without makeup, without colors, finding an intrinsic net worth without any props.
So very different personal experiences of the same practice.
And the book highlights the aspect of decidedly sexual power related to the mikvah.
Sexual power, how so?
Well, the mikvah purifies her for sex, and the book notes that Jewish law explicitly guarantees women's rights to sexual pleasure. It's called the commandment of Ona. One woman is quoted describing how going to the mikvah makes her feel like her husband awaits her like an honored guest, elevating their marital intimacy.
Interesting.
Another notes that Jewish law allows and even encourages women to initiate sex and ensures their right to pleasure, quoting a woman who says, "It's good to say that I want this or that, especially because the woman is supposed to enjoy. If you want sex or whatever, then he has to agree and you have the right to ask for it."
So what looks like rigid control from the outside can, for some practitioners, be experienced as empowerment, spiritual connection, and even a source of sexual agency.
The discussion of the veil, or hijab, among Muslim women presents a similar complexity. While often seen by secular feminists as a symbol of oppression, the book described how many young Muslim women choose to embrace it.
Like the example of young Muslim women in France who insisted on wearing veils in public schools despite secular laws prohibiting them.
Right. And a U.S. study mentioned in the book found that Muslim women saw wearing the hijab as an act of opposition to colonialism and a clear affirmation of the gender differences prescribed by their religion.
And there was that dissertation study?
Itsuko Muruoka's study at Stony Brook, yes. Looking at young Muslim women students who decided to start wearing the veil, often against the wishes of their parents, who were eager for them to Americanize.
That's another unexpected layer of rebellion against parental assimilation via religious conservatism.
Muruoka's main argument, according to the book, was that this was primarily an act of self-identification. By conforming to a specific religious dress code, they were differentiating themselves, forging an identity as a minority, an outsider, different from their non-Muslim peers.
So using conformity within their faith to differentiate themselves from the dominant secular society.
Exactly. Though the book adds a caveat that the parents were often from countries like Indonesia or Malaysia, where veiling isn't as common, suggesting these young women might have been influenced by media like Al Jazeera, promoting a more unified, visible, global Islamic identity.
Still, it highlights the multiple meanings.
Regardless of the specific motivations, these multiple, sometimes contradictory meanings attached to practices like the veil or mikveh connect to Rosine Perelberg's idea, cited in the book.
What's her idea?
She suggests that power can be exercised from a subordinate position, and that fluidity is fundamental to both the way in which gender roles are constructed and the respective positions from which men and women perceive themselves.
That's a fascinating concept that even within seemingly rigid structures, individuals can find ways to exercise agency and construct their own meaning.
It adds a layer of complexity to just seeing these practices as purely oppressive.
And speaking of the body, the book transitions from these practices to how its pleasures, particularly sexuality, also become a focal point for intense religious regulation and passion.
Yes, there's often a general theme across many religions of suppressing sex, or at least channeling it for the glory of God. But, as always, the book notes there are many interpretations.
We just heard about the Orthodox Jewish view, where sex is encouraged and both partners are entitled to fulfillment within marriage.
Contrast that with the historical Christian approach, particularly within ascetic traditions. The book highlights a strong emphasis on the repression of sexuality. Sex was ideally avoided, only permissible for procreation.
St. Augustine's influence.
His theology viewed sex as the vehicle for transmitting original sin, casting a real pall over it. Celibacy became seen as a morally and spiritually superior state.
And lust.
Lust was a deadly sin, and women were often depicted as the primary source and repository of this dangerous carnal desire. The infamous 15th century witch-hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, is quoted with a chilling line: "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable."
Wow, that's, a pretty bleak view of female sexuality.
And it reflects centuries of negative interpretation, yet the book contrasts this with contemporary trends.
Like Christian sex manuals.
Right, noting the existence of best-selling Christian sex manuals today that promote the idea that God wants couples to have great sex, provided, of course, they are married, heterosexual, and faithful to each other.
Which must lead to incredible confusion for many contemporary Christians growing up with such mixed messages.
The book captures this perfectly with a quote from a young man in Lubbock, Texas.
What did he say?
He said life there taught him two things. One is that God loves you and you are going to hell. The other is that sex is the most awful, filthy thing on earth, and you should save it for someone you love.
Woo! That really distills the paradox many face.
It does. And the book notes that across many religions, that someone you love is explicitly defined as someone of the opposite gender.
Which brings us to the regulation of homosexuality. The book states that discouraging or prohibiting homosexuality is a key way religions maintain and police the concept of gender difference.
And this is particularly true of monotheistic religions.
To illustrate this, the book draws on detailed Pew Survey statistics from 2007 and 2006 regarding American views on homosexuality.
Right. Overall, about half the U.S. population accepted it at the time, but the views vary dramatically by religious affiliation.
The data shows strong disapproval among Jehovah's Witnesses.
75% say discourage.
Muslims, 60%, Mormons and evangelicals, around 2/3.
But conversely, majorities of Catholics, 58%, say accept. Mainline Protestants, 56%. Jews, 79%, Buddhists, 82%, and the religiously unaffiliated, 71%, indicated acceptance.
Historically, black churches, Orthodox Christians, and Hindus were more divided, according to the source.
The surveys also linked religiosity itself to views on gay marriage. The 2007 data showed 55% of Americans overall opposed it.
But attendance at religious services was a major predictor of opposition.
Huge predictor. 73% of those who attended religious services weekly or more often opposed gay marriage, compared to only 21% of those who attended less often.
And white evangelicals had the highest opposition rate at 81%.
Majorities of black Protestants, 64%, and Latino Catholics, 52%, also opposed it. White non-Hispanic Catholics and white mainline Protestants showed pluralities opposing it.
Only the religiously unaffiliated group had a clear majority supporting gay marriage, 60%.
The 2006 survey looked at civil unions, showing slightly broader acceptance, but again demonstrating the same patterns of opposition linked to religious affiliation and frequency of attendance, particularly among white evangelicals, black Protestants, and frequent attendees.
So, the data presented in the book clearly shows how religious belief and practice, particularly within monotheistic traditions and certain denominations, are strongly correlated with views that reinforce traditional gender roles by prohibiting same-sex relationships.
And this leads us to what the book calls one of the great paradoxes, the gender of religiosity.
This is truly counterintuitive based on everything we've just discussed. Religions, particularly the dominant Western monotheisms, promote gender difference and male domination through their core doctrines, their institutional structures, and even their central symbolic representations of God and prophets.
We've seen examples of daily prayers affirming male superiority, theological concepts like the Trinity, scriptural declarations that men are in charge, and historical codes enshrining women's subjugation.
So given all that, the book poses the question, where, you might ask, are the women?
That answers, in the pews. This is the paradox.
It really is. Logically, you might expect that institutions and doctrines so centered on male authority and defining women as secondary would be domains primarily populated by men. You might expect more men to be religious and active participants.
But the reality, supported by extensive data in the book, is the opposite.
The book unequivocally states, women are far more religious than men.
Looking at the U.S. context, which the book describes as the most religious industrial nation, over 95% believe in God or a spirit. But the gender gap in how important faith is stark.
How stark?
Over 3/4 of women, 77%, say their faith is very important, compared to just over 3/5 of men, 63%.
That's a significant difference. Women also express belief in life after death at a higher rate than men, by a margin of 60% to 40%.
And when you look at religious practice, praying, reading scripture, attending services, women consistently lead men. According to a 2008 survey cited, women are more likely to identify with and actively practice a religion.
Of those attending religious services weekly, 60% are female.
And for those attending more than once a week, the proportion jumps even higher to 70% female.
Wow, so women are really filling the seats.
Overwhelmingly, in many contexts. On the other hand, men are significantly more likely to report having no religious affiliation at all, nearly 1 in 5 men, compared to about 13% of women.
And men are twice as likely to identify as agnostic or atheist.
5.5% compared to just 2.6% of women, according to the data presented.
The book notes this gender gap varies across traditions, though.
Right. It's around 8% among Protestants and Catholics, but it becomes much larger, ballooning to 20% in historically black churches.
Where women often comprise 70% and 90% of the congregation.
And among Jehovah's Witnesses. The author specifically points out that Black women are, in fact, the most religious demographic group in the U.S.
Interestingly, the gender gap is reversed, though more modestly, among Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindu Americans.
Yeah, the patterns aren't universal across all faiths listed. The book mentions some recent evidence suggesting the gap might be narrowing slightly.
But not necessarily because men are getting more religious.
Right. The author suggests it might be linked to women's participation declining, potentially as the demands of full-time work and the second shift of domestic responsibilities leave less time for religious life.
That makes sense. Life pressures impacting participation.
The book also observes that the degree to which religious structures enforce gender inequality varies historically and contextually. During times of prosperity and relative social stability, religious norms around gender might relax. Women might make advances in secular life and even challenge traditional prescriptions within their faiths.
But during periods of social or economic crisis, that's when you see the fundamentalist reaction.
That's the argument. A call for a return to back to basics, a redrawing of boundaries between the faithful in-group and the perceived secularizing out-group. During crises, religions often turn inward, demanding stricter adherence to tradition.
And the fundamentalist impulse is described as this drive to return to the perceived purity of basic texts and traditions.
According to the book, fundamentalists often seek to restore women to what they believe is their rightful place as a way to impose order and stability in the face of social and economic upheaval.
So as women and men gain more equality globally,
Fundamentalists assert that the differences between them, which seem to be eroding in the secular world, are in fact indelible, fixed, and divinely ordained.
so the rise of fundamentalism and its emphasis on rigid gender roles can be seen, according to the book, as a direct reaction to increasing gender equality in the wider society.
Which leads us to consider religion not just as a set of beliefs, but as a gendered social institution.
Right, viewing it sociologically, religion is a large institution. It employs people, creates career paths, owns property, runs programs.
And the practices of the institution often mirror its doctrine. Since many monotheistic traditions posit divinely sanctioned gender differences that justify inequality, their institutional structures naturally reflect this through sex segregation and hierarchical roles.
The book notes that in the U.S., religious institutions have unique legal standing, allowing them to use gender as a criterion for hiring and membership, within limits, of course.
Can have ritual stonings, for example.
Right. But the author argues that sex segregation within religious institutions is a primary mechanism that makes gender inequality seem natural or inevitable.
How so?
It's both an expression of the underlying belief in inequality and a way that inequality is maintained and reproduced. If men are always in charge, it starts to look like that's just how things are meant to be.
Historically, women were explicitly barred from ministry and leadership roles. Antoinette Brown, a Congregationalist, is noted as the first woman minister ordained in the U.S. back in 1853.
And the book points out she married into quite a family. Her sister-in-law was Elizabeth Blackwell.
The first woman to graduate from medical school in the U.S. Trailblazers.
Definitely. But there has been significant, though uneven, progress in some denominations more recently.
Like the data from the Association of Theological Schools.
Showing a massive increase, over 700% in 30 years, in women pursuing Master of Divinity degrees. By 2002, 32% of seminarians were female.
And the book highlights the variation across different branches of Judaism.
Right.
Reform Judaism permits women and gay rabbis. Conservative Judaism permits women, but not gay rabbis. Orthodox Judaism prohibits both.
Reform Judaism has been ordaining women since 1972 and now counts over 400 female rabbis.
Various Protestant denominations also permit women clergy, and some permit gay clergy. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America doubled its percentage of ordained women to 16% between 1991 and 2003.
The Episcopal Church has ordained women since 1973, with women now making up nearly 14% of their priests. Almost 1 in 5 Lutheran ministers is a woman.
However, the book starkly contrasts this with other traditions, like the historically Black church in America. Yeah, only about 5% of pastors are female, and they often serve in smaller, more remote or troubled congregations. Black women also constitute only about 5% of seminary students overall, despite being the most religious demographic.
That's a real disparity. And the Catholic Church remains steadfastly opposed to ordaining women and gay men.
What's the rationale given in the book?
The book explains the rationale often given. Priests must physically resemble Jesus, meaning they must be male. And in the mid-1990s, Cardinal Ratzinger declared the papal prohibition on women's ordination to be infallible teaching.
Meaning it's the definitive word of God, closed to any debate.
Exactly. The Southern Baptist Convention, one of the largest Protestant denominations in the U.S., even reversed course in 2000.
What did they do?
Officially refused to ordain women ministers, despite having ordained hundreds since 1964.
Wow, a reversal. The Catholic Church's requirement for clerical celibacy is also discussed.
Linked to the traditional teaching that sex transmits original sin, representatives of God must therefore renounce this act of transmission.
It seems there's a huge disconnect between the official stance and the beliefs of many lay Catholics, though.
The book notes this as well. It points out that a papal commission in the 1970s found no scriptural basis for prohibiting women from the priesthood.
No scriptural basis.
And a 2005 Associated Press poll found that nearly 2/3, 64% American Catholics believed women should be ordained.
Yet, the official position hasn't changed. The book cites the example of Father Roy Bourgeois,
Threatened with excommunication in 2008 for participating in a woman's ordination ceremony.
His response, quoted in the book, is powerful. Deeper than the hurt, the sadness, there's a peace that comes from knowing I followed my conscience in addressing this great injustice.
It highlights the internal conflict some face between institutional rules and personal conviction.
So, despite official rules, women are incredibly present and active within religious institutions, particularly in the Catholic Church where they can't be ordained.
Absolutely. The book provides data showing that at the turn of the 21st century, over 3 out of every 5 people working in religious settings, in roles from clergy to janitorial staff, were women, 62%.
62%.
Women constitute over half of students studying for clergy in general, and over a quarter of those pursuing advanced theology degrees.
And the book highlights a critical practical breakdown in the Catholic Church's ban due to a severe recruitment crisis.
Tell me about that.
Yes. The number of priests in the U.S. is half what it was in the 1960s, and there are now more priests over the age of 90 than under 30.
Wow, that's a demographic cliff.
It is. And this practical necessity has forced religious duties onto lay people.
And the vast majority of these lay church people are?
Women, 82%.
82%. So they're doing the work.
They are now performing ministerial functions like distributing communion, assisting with baptisms, confirmations, and marriages. The only core sacrament they are typically still prohibited from performing is administering last rites.
So, while the doctrine hasn't shifted, the operational reality of the institution is creating a de facto change.
The book offers a provocative speculation based purely on this trend.
Which is?
Women may eventually be ordained in the Catholic Church not because the Vatican has a theological change of heart, but simply because the Church will run out of men willing to commit to lifelong celibacy.
Necessity, rather than principle, could drive the change.
That's the speculation offered in the source.
Beyond the strictly religious functions, the book notes the significant civic roles religious institutions play in the U.S.
Right. They function as vital community centers, often stepping in where municipal funding is lacking. They host everything from daycare and classes to recovery programs, sports leagues, meal services, and charities, alongside religious education.
A huge range of secular activities, and who is largely responsible for running these non-doctrinal components.
In the U.S., the book points out it's primarily women who maintain the non-doctrinal components, organizing programs, managing secular functions, and overseeing the physical upkeep of the buildings.
So let's recap this paradox. Women are the majority adherents, the majority of lay workers, increasingly taking on ministerial duties out of necessity and managing the day-to-day life of the institution.
While the highest positions in core doctrines often remain firmly male-dominated, it highlights the paradox from another angle.
This dynamic leads the book to identify what it calls 2 parallel problems concerning the gender of religiosity.
Okay, what are they?
How to make men more religious, and how to address, perhaps decrease or transfer, women's overwhelming religiosity.
Why does the book suggest women are more religious in the first place, beyond just demographics?
Well, one reason offered is that religious observance itself is often gender-coded in many cultural contexts. There's this implicit idea that real men don't pray, or at least they don't need to in the same way women do. Men are supposed to be in control, handling things themselves.
So a perceived contradiction between traditional masculinity, power, control, and traditional religiosity, service, subservience, acknowledging dependence on a higher power.
Exactly, and this isn't a new observation. Religious leaders have been grappling with how to attract men for a long time.
The book quotes a mid-19th century observer remarking he had never seen a country where religion had so strong a hold upon the women or a slighter hold upon the men than the United States.
Wow, even back then. By the turn of the 20th century, Protestant ministers in the U.S. were openly worried that religion had become feminized.
Feminized how?
They felt it was dominated by sentimental piety and sanctimonious moralism, becoming primarily a platform for women's social reform movements like prohibition.
And this wasn't seen as appealing to men who felt they needed to steel themselves for the rigors of competition in the industrializing world.
Right. Henry James Sr. lamented the loss of virile religion, replaced, he felt, by feeble Unitarian sentimentality, stating that the typical minister moved in a world of women.
Even the visual representation of Jesus seemed to reinforce this idea of a feminized religion.
How so?
Paintings and drawings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries often depicted Jesus as slender, almost frail, with bony fingers and soft, gentle eyes, someone who embodies meekness and turning the other cheek. Not exactly a rugged figure.
A Methodist minister is quoted describing the conversion experience for a man as becoming patient, gentle, artless, essentially ceasing to be what was considered a real man.
All of this led to a question posed by a disgruntled guy, quoted in the book, "Have we a religion for men?"
And the answer that emerged, according to the book, was muscular Christianity.
Muscular Christianity, okay.
This movement was explicit in its goal to bring manliness to church and to keep it awake when it got there. It sought to re-virilize the image of Jesus and masculinize the church itself.
Like evangelist Billy Sunday.
Exactly. A former baseball player, a leading figure, he's quoted saying Jesus was no dough-faced, lick-spittle proposition, but rather the greatest scrapper who ever lived.
Wow. Quite the image change. Book titles appeared like The Manhood of the Master, The Manliness of Christ, and The Manly Christ, all aimed at portraying Jesus as a rugged, physically capable figure.
Billy Sunday's own ministry embodied this. He organized massive, men-only tent revivals, using his athletic background and adopting the persona of a manly man.
Journalists of the time praised him for standing, speaking, and working like a man, treating people in a manly fashion, calling him not an imitation but a manly man.
His revivals were high-energy affairs where he used colorful, aggressive language to celebrate Jesus as a he-man.
Like his insults.
Yeah, he famously hurled insults at mainstream ministers, pretentious, pliable mental perverts, intellectuals, fudge-eating mollycoddles, and capitalists, big, fat, hog-jowled, weasel-eyed pussy lobsters.
Goodness. Quite the vocabulary.
And his sermons, like the fighting saint, were filled with fiery rhetoric, calling for deliverance from offhanded, flabby-cheeked, effeminate, ossified, three-carat Christianity, and proclaiming that Jesus could go like a six-cylinder engine, and that he'd put my fist on the nose of the man who hasn't got grit enough to be a Christian.
That's intense imagery, designed explicitly to appeal to a certain vision of masculinity. The book notes that while this movement had historical roots, this fervor reappeared in the 1990s.
With evangelical preachers like Jerry Falwell.
Right, who echoed the theme, stating, Christ wasn't effeminate. The man who lived on this earth was a man with muscles. Christ was a he-man.
The most visible manifestation of this in the 90s was Promise Keepers.
Ah, yes, Promise Keepers, founded in 1990 by former football coach Bill McCartney.
They held enormous men-only rallies in sports stadiums, places explicitly chosen because they were where men felt comfortable gathering. They used sports metaphors, calling ministers coaches and assistants referees, aiming to bring men back to Jesus.
And while they incorporated some evangelical themes like racial reconciliation and service, a central tenet was reasserting men's God-ordained position as head of the family and master of women.
The book quotes a directive from their popular book, The 7 Promises of a Promise Keeper.
What did it say?
Instructing men to sit down with their wives and say, honey, I've made a terrible mistake. I've given you my role in leading this family. Now I must reclaim that role.
Reclaim it.
And the instruction explicitly states, I'm not suggesting that you ask for the role back. I'm urging you to take it back. There can be no compromise here. If you're going to lead, you must lead.
Take it back, not ask. That language makes the goal very clear. Reestablishing male authority with divine backing.
Yeah. Other movements also adopted this pumped-up theology.
Like John Jacobs' The Power Team, featuring bodybuilders performing feats of strength like breaking bricks or ice.
Claiming Jesus was no skinny little man, but a man's man, using strength to illustrate Christ's power.
And the JBC men? Jesus beer chips?
Right. who deliver a shock and awe gospel to manly men using film clips from violent movies like Gladiator and Braveheart to expound a manly gospel saturated with what the book calls redemptive violence.
Sermons like Jesus is no Mr. Rogers and their website letsrollmen.com, which links military masculinity, the 9/11 attacks, and evangelical Christianity, further demonstrate this trend.
Seattle evangelical minister Mark Driscoll is also mentioned,
Using language strikingly similar to Billy Sunday.
claiming the mainstream church has transformed Jesus into a Richard Simmons hippie queer Christ, a neutered and limp-wristed popular sky fairy.
And for Driscoll, like the Promise Keepers, reasserting traditional gender roles with women utterly subservient to men is seen as non-negotiable, God's divine plan.
The book's analysis of these movements is critical, though. It argues they are only partially about celebrating man or masculinity.
What else are they about?
They also reveal how flexible and socially constructed the portrayals of religious figures can be. Jesus has been depicted to support wildly different social agendas throughout history. Socialist, capitalist, racist, civil rights advocate.
It also points out that while the gender gap in religiosity is actually larger in Europe than in the U.S., there haven't been comparable large-scale masculinization movements there.
Suggesting this isn't a universal response to the demographic gap.
Right, and this brings us back to the core connection the author draws. These movements are a response to women.
Or, as the book refines it, more accurately, to women's increased equality in the wider society.
Liberal Methodist minister Katie Ladd is quoted, providing historical perspective. It's only since women have been in church leadership that this backlash has come.
So, the book concludes, the need for a re-virilized Jesus and a masculinized religion seems most urgent for those who feel their traditional authority is threatened by women gaining ground.
As the author puts it powerfully, one might even say, the more equal women get, the more masculine God becomes in the eyes of his earthly stewards.
That's a sharp insight. The perceived masculinity of God isn't fixed, but shifts in response to human social dynamics around gender and power.
But alongside these efforts to reassert male dominance, the book also explores a significant counter-movement. Feminist-inspired efforts to challenge traditional subordination and create alternative forms of spirituality centered on women's experience.
Okay, the other side of the coin. This movement directly pushes back against the masculinization of God and the church hierarchy. Its methods include reinterpreting existing sacred texts and retrieving alternative texts and histories.
The book mentions historical examples in American history, like the Shakers and Christian Science, as Protestant sects led and dominated by women.
And it revisits Leonard Swidler from the early 1970s.
Who argued that Jesus himself was a feminist, actively promoting the dignity and equality of women in a society that largely devalued them.
And bringing us back to the era of Billy Sunday, the book introduces Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
His Religion and Hers from 1923.
Yes. She turned the ideas of muscular Christianity completely on their head. Gilman tackled a fundamental question. If religion is supposed to guide us, why haven't religion, morality, and ethics made humanity genuinely good?
Most theologians would blame human sinfulness, but Gilman offered a radical inversion.
She argued the problem wasn't humanity's inherent fallibility, but that the religion foisted upon us by men in charge had actually led us astray by focusing on the wrong things.
Exactly. Specifically, life after death rather than the crucial realities of life before death. She's quoted saying, "Religion, our greatest help, has been injured by coming through the minds of men alone."
She clarified this wasn't an inherent fault of men themselves, but an inevitable consequence of what she saw as the great tragedy of our species, the subjugation of the female.
She detailed the many negative consequences stemming from this original sin of making a private servant of the mother of the race.
And mirroring sociologist Jesse Bernard's later idea of his and hers marriage, Gilman proposed there were effectively two distinct religions, his religion and hers religion. Okay, break those down. His religion.
According to Gilman, his religion is fundamentally preoccupied with death and the afterlife. It grew out of men's historical concerns with war, hunting, and competition. The central question is always, what is going to happen to me after I am dead?
In heaven.
Heaven, in this his religion, is imagined as a hypermasculine paradise.
Oh.
Happy hunting grounds, as she put it, definitely no happy nursing grounds. And this framework, she argued, inherently justifies war.
How so?
Gilman wrote, "No peace can ever be maintained in a wholly male world," contrasting it with the claim that no war could ever endure for long in a world of equal men and women.
Okay. And her religion, in contrast.
Her religion is life-affirming, rooted in women's lived experience of childbirth, nurturing, and sustaining life. It's birth-based. The defining question isn't about death, but what must be done for the child who is born.
Focusing on life, not afterlife.
Right. The Great Mother is seen as the ultimate source of life and humanity, a contrast to the male-centric creation narratives. And the mother, by her nature, is inherently altruistic. She works not to get, but to give.
And God in her religion.
God is experienced as within us, not a distant external authority figure above us.
These ideas of Gilman, rooting spirituality in women's concrete embodied experience as mother, resonated strongly with the later feminist movement. Feminist theologians began actively working to emancipate women's spirituality from patriarchal constraints.
The book outlines several key approaches or fronts for this endeavor. First, reinterpreting traditional texts to find more favorable or egalitarian meanings.
As Mary Daly argued in her first book, the authors of texts like the Bible were men of their time and undoubtedly brought their own prejudices.
Right. It's challenging, she noted, to truly extract the original intentions from layers of later interpretation. But, crucially, the texts themselves often contain ambiguities or statements that seem more egalitarian than the dominant interpretations.
Like Galatians 3.28.
Exactly. Neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus.
Interpreted literally, this verse suggests that in the eyes of Christ, fundamental distinctions based on ethnicity, social status, or gender are erased.
Right. And since claims of inequality are often based on assertions of fundamental difference, this verse, if taken as a core principle, undermines the basis for gender inequality.
The book uses the example of slave owners using the Bible to justify slavery to show how contested and crucial interpretation is the same text can be used to argue for freedom or oppression.
A really powerful point. Second, retrieving female religious leaders and lost texts from historical obscurity.
Finding the hidden figures.
Yeah, actively searching for prophetesses, priests, goddesses, and women theologians who have been marginalized or forgotten by patriarchal historical narratives. It also includes restoring lost or suppressed texts, like the Gnostic Gospels, which sometimes offer alternative perspectives.
But does this retrieval resonate as much as the established texts?
The book notes, it might not always fully resonate with the faithful in the same way canonical texts do, as these retrieved teachings may not possess the same rhetorical power or spiritual depth as the established prophets.
The book offers an analogy here.
To searching for great female Renaissance artists or composers, finding them is important history. But it also raises the question of the historical circumstances that prevented women from reaching that level of recognized greatness in the first place. It cites figures like Christine de Pizan or Hildegard von Bingen, who did achieve prominence despite the odds.
The book also mentions the importance of looking beyond official doctrine to how people actually experience the sacred.
Like Laurel Kendall's work on women shamans in small Korean villages. Despite the dominance of patriarchal official religions, at the practical daily level, it's the women shamans who provide essential spiritual services to the community.
Offering a contrasting vision of women's spiritual power and practice.
Exactly. Third, actively revisioning female spirituality experientially, anchoring it in women's concrete lived experience.
This approach, like Gilman's, links women's presumed connection to life as mothers and to the earth, Mother Earth, to a potentially different and presumably superior spirituality.
This is the root of ecofeminism.
Ecofeminism is described as a spiritual branch of feminism that celebrates women's intimate connection to life and the earth, seeing it as a potential source of salvation for the planet itself.
The belief is that women, through their connection to birth and nurturing, are inherently closer to the Earth's natural balances and rhythms, and therefore better equipped to help realign Mother Earth with harmony.
Charlene Spretnak is quoted describing the Earth as a bountiful female, the ever-giving mother, with rituals sometimes performed in womb-like caves.
And ecofeminism posits that patriarchy was born from a transformation of awe for this powerful female life-giving force into envy, resentment, and fear.
With the ultimate objective of patriarchy being to prevent women from achieving their full potential, they almost succeeded, Spretnak is quoted saying.
Finally, the book mentions a more direct or mythic retrieval of the past, often invoking older, non-monotheistic spiritualities.
Like Mary Daly's gynecology.
Which seeks to invoke a feminine spirituality deeply connected to what she called the witch within ourselves.
And the contemporary revival of Wicca.
Cited as an example of this, the retrieval of ancient polytheistic and naturalist theologies by women who proudly identify as witches, worship a mother goddess, and focus on the intimate connections among all living creatures.
So feminist spirituality, as the book presents it, is not just a critical response to male-dominated religion. It's also an active, diverse effort to create alternative spiritual pathways and ways of understanding the sacred that are centered on women's experiences and perspectives.
It's a powerful testament, the book concludes, to the human yearnings for the sacred realm in which all are equal on earth and in heaven.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, the book leaves us grappling with that major irony. An institution that has been, by the author's analysis, absolutely central to the creation and maintenance of gender inequality and male domination.
Through its doctrine, its institutions, its very symbols.
He finds more adherence among women than among men.
And the book offers some possible explanations for why men are less religious. Perhaps it suggests male dominance is so naturalized within these structures that men simply take it for granted. They don't need to actively participate in the religious institution to sustain their privileged position.
Or the book offers a more provocative analogy.
The housework analogy.
Yeah, maybe men aren't religious for the same reason they often don't do their share of the housework, because they don't have to.
That's a bold comparison. It links the religious sphere directly to the domestic one in terms of power dynamics.
Feminist theologian Mary Daly is quoted again by the author, offering her perspective on the deep connection between gendered religion and gendered society.
Daly argued that the symbol of the Father God, created and sustained by patriarchy, serves society by making the oppression of women appear right and fitting.
So, if God is a father figure ruling the universe,
then it seems, in the nature of things and according to a divine plan, that society on earth should also be male-dominated. The symbol reinforces the social structure.
the book ends with a powerful reminder from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the pioneers of the women's rights movement in the mid-19th century.
What did she say?
She said, "The first step in the elevation of women under all systems of religion is to convince them that the great spirit of the universe is in no way responsible for any of these absurdities."
Absurdities. That's a striking word choice for these inequalities. And her point, echoed by the book, is that religion is inherently political because it deals with fundamental secular arrangements of power, obligation, and inequality between men and women.
Exactly. And the book leaves us with this final, thought-provoking distinction, building on Stanton's idea. God, the omnipotent and infallible, created the heavens and the earth.
But men, the book notes, are frail, fallible, and tempted.
Therefore, according to the book's interpretation of this historical tension, gender inequality isn't the work of God.
It's the work of man.
That leaves you with quite a lot to consider about the line between divine will and human interpretation when we talk about gender within faith traditions.
Indeed, it really challenges the notion that hierarchical gender roles are simply handed down from above, doesn't it?
A powerful analysis from this chapter. That's our deep dive for today.